I'm sorry. I thought this place was abandoned. I have nowhere else to go. Snow fell in thick, silent blankets across the frozen Montana plains. It was the deep winter of 1887, and night pressed hard against the windows of a solitary log cabin. Inside, the fire had gone dim, and the wind sighed through the rafters like a voice long forgotten. Elias Granger, 32, had spent the day wrenching frozen pipe joints from beneath his barn. His knuckles were raw, his breath visible even indoors. As dusk settled its gray weight across the sky, he trudged back to the cabin oil lamp in one hand, rifle slung loosely on his shoulder. He was thinking only of stew and silence until he stepped inside and saw the footprints. 3 of them. Tiny wet marks curving toward the hearth, then back again as if whoever made them had nearly turned around, but hadn't. Elias froze. His fingers curled instinctively toward the rifle rack, but before he could lift it, a small voice reached him from the shadows. I thought this place was abandoned. I'm sorry. The voice trembled like wind chimes in a storm, frightened but not false. Elias narrowed his eyes and stepped forward. There, bathed in the weak glow of the stove light, stood a young woman. Her dress was caked with snow and mud, her cheeks blotched red from the cold. Her hands, white-knuckled and stiff, clutched her shawl like a shield. And her eyes flicked from the rifle to the door behind her like she was still halfway to running. Annabbeth Moore, 24. A mail-order bride sent to a town that had already forgotten she was coming. She had wandered 30 miles on foot, following fading wagon trails and the faint promise of smoke on the wind. No one met her. No one was waiting. Until now. Elias didn't speak right away. He stood in that moment longer than he should have because something inside him wasn't sure how to move. Not from fear, but from memory. His cabin had been silent for 2 winters ever since fever took his wife. He had spoken to no one but his mule, and grief had made him careful, made him cold. And yet here she stood, trembling alone and clearly not lying. She didn't beg. She didn't bargain. She simply said what most men don't dare to admit: I have nowhere else to go. Elias exhaled slowly, then lowered the rifle. He crossed the room and pulled a thick wool blanket from the cupboard. She flinched as he stepped forward, but didn't move away when he draped it across her shoulders. He crouched by the fire, sparked the kindling, and fed the coals until flame caught. Behind him, she stood motionless, half frozen, fully stunned. You can stay the night, he said quietly, just till the storm passes. She nodded barely. The kettle hissed. 2 tin cups were placed. Her fingers trembled when they wrapped around the warm metal. She didn't speak again, but the silence wasn't empty. It was shared. And maybe that was what saved them both. Sometimes a stranger at your door isn't a burden, but a beginning. Tell me, if you were Elias, what would you have done? Have you ever offered warmth to someone unexpected, or been the one on the other side of the door? Let me know where you're watching from tonight. I'd love to know which corner of the world you're bringing your heart to this story from, because this is just the beginning. The storm howled through the Montana night like a restless ghost, but inside the cabin only the fire spoke. Elias didn't say much after that first quiet offer of shelter. He wasn't a man of many words to begin with, and truth be told, it had been so long since anyone sat across from him that he'd forgotten how to begin again. Annabbeth sat hunched near the hearth, the blanket still wrapped around her eyes, tracing the flames like she was afraid they'd vanish if she blinked. Her hands bruised, chapped too thin, curled around the warm tin cup, like it was the only real thing left in the world. She hadn't asked for more. Not food, not a bath, not even space to sleep. Just warmth. and she barely even took that. Elias noticed it then, the way she sat with her shoulders tight and her knees close together, like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. What kind of life teaches someone that? He moved about the room slowly, pulled the old iron pot from the shelf, ladled some beans and salted pork into it, let it simmer. He didn't ask if she was hungry, but he saw the way her eyes followed the kettle, the way her fingers tightened on the cup when the scent reached the air. "It ain't fancy," he murmured, "but it'll fill the quiet some." She didn't answer, but she nodded, just once. And somehow it felt like a whole sentence. Trust doesn't always come in words. Sometimes it arrives with steam rising from a chipped bowl, or a coat left quietly on the back of a chair. As the hours passed, the silence grew softer, not heavier. Elias handed her a spoon. She took it. He watched as she ate carefully, like someone used to making things last. No smacking lips, no second helpings, just grateful and still. When she was done, she stood without being asked, found the wash basin in the corner, and began to rinse her dish. He hadn't expected that. Most folks, if they're strangers, they'll leave the mess behind. "I hope you don't mind," she said quietly. "I thought it best to earn my keep." Elias shrugged. "If you break something, I reckon it'll be your trouble to fix it." It was the closest he'd come to a joke in months. She smiled. It was faint, but it reached her eyes. For a long while after that, they didn't speak. She sat by the window, patching one of his old flannel shirts with a mending needle she found in a wooden box. Her stitches were even, her hands steady, her face calmer than before. Elias poured 2 more cups of pine tea and set one near her. She looked up, nodded once in thanks, and took a sip. That night, as the wind shrieked against the shutters and the snow piled in soft waves outside, Elias sat by the hearth with a whittling knife in hand. He didn't carve much, just shapes in the wood to pass the time. But he noticed when she dozed off on the bench near the stove the blanket slipping from her shoulder. He rose, covered her with it again, then settled back in his chair. The clock on the mantel hadn't ticked in over a year, but something about this moment made time feel alive again. She murmured something as she slept, just one word. "Thank you." He didn't reply, but his heart did. Outside, the storm still roared, but inside, the silence was no longer empty. It was shared, and it was beginning to soften them both. By morning, the storm hadn't let up. In fact, it had deepened. Snow drifted high against the windows, soft and heavy like sifted flour. The sky outside was the color of ash, and not even the sound of birds dared pierce the hush. Inside the cabin, the world moved slower, but it moved. Annabbeth awoke first. Elias heard her from his chair by the hearth, where he'd dozed lightly, arms folded across his chest. She didn't say a word, just moved quietly about the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back with a ribbon she must have pulled from her satchel. She scrubbed the tin dishes from the night before and set them out to dry. Elias rose without a word, put on his coat, stepped outside to check the mule and crack ice from the water trough. When he came back in, the kettle was already warm, and 2 cups sat on the table. "I hope you don't mind," she said again, voice soft. "I thought I'd best be useful." He glanced at her, not unkindly. "Long as you don't burn down the place, I reckon we'll be just fine." Her smile was small, but it stayed longer this time. Sometimes it's the quiet tasks, sweeping a floor, patching a sleeve, warming a cup, that become the language 2 strangers speak when words still feel too dangerous. The snow didn't stop that day, or the next. They were snowbound, 2 people stitched together by circumstance, by the mercy of firewood hot broth, and the uncertain patience of time. Elias kept to his routines. He split logs, salted meat, boiled water. But now there was a second cup on the table, a second pair of boots drying by the hearth. A woman's hum, tentative and low, drifting into the corners of the cabin when she thought he wasn't listening. On the second evening, Elias noticed a raw patch of skin across his hand. The cold had bitten deeper than he'd realized, red and cracked. He didn't say anything, but when he sat down, Annabbeth was already kneeling beside him, pulling a small tin from her bag. "You should have told me," she said, smoothing balm across his hand with practiced fingers. He winced. "I've had worse." She looked up at him just once and replied, "No, I have too." She wrapped the hand with linen gentle and sure, then stood and moved back to her corner. No fuss, no thanks expected. That night, Elias poured the last of the pine tea into her cup and left his own empty. She noticed, didn't say anything, just took the cup in her cold hands and nodded. For the first time in 2 winters, he felt less alone in the room. Not because of the tea, or the stitching, or the songs she hummed when she thought he couldn't hear, but because she was there, moving through the silence like someone who didn't need to fill it, just share it. Later, after they'd eaten hard biscuits and root stew, Annabbeth looked toward the door. Her voice was almost too quiet to hear. "I used to count days by letters." Elias looked up, surprised. "My fiancé and I. He wrote me every day until Gettysburg." From her bag she pulled a yellowed snowflake made of folded paper. Delicate. Fragile. This was the last one, she said. He wrote, "I'll make you 100 more when I return." She laid it on the table like a sacred thing. Elias stared for a long moment, then said softly, "I was at Gettysburg." She looked at him still. "Second day. Left side. Lost 3 ribs and a piece of my hearing, and a lot more besides." They didn't say another word. Didn't need to. The snowflake sat between them alongside the past they didn't ask for but somehow shared. The storm broke on the 5th morning. The wind fell silent and a pale winter sun crept over the white horizon. Trees stood glazed in ice fences buried halfway to the top rail. Elias hitched the mule-packed blankets into the sled and helped Annabbeth climb aboard. She said nothing, but her gloved hands clung to the wooden rail, and her eyes never left the road ahead. The path to Galloway was little more than guesswork. 20 miles of frozen ruts and silence broken only by hooves crunching through frost. They didn't speak. Not because there was nothing to say, but because parting words are often the hardest to find. When the church came into view, squat and plain against the silver sky, Annabeth's breath hitched just slightly. She straightened her shoulders, wiped her palms on her skirt. Inside, the warmth hit first, then the hush. 3 women sat near the back pew, knitting in silence. One looked up when Elias entered, her gaze narrowing slightly as it landed on the woman beside him. Pastor Whitaker came down the aisle, old, and bent his collar slightly askew. "She's a mail-order bride," Elias said plainly. "Came all the way north. No one met her. I figured the church might sort things out." The pastor blinked, pulled a heavy ledger from the pulpit, and flipped through with slow fingers. "Name Annabbeth Moore," she answered softly. His eyes scanned the page. No signature. No groom received. No payment recorded. He shut the book with a soft thud. "She's not legally wed." "I never said I was," she whispered. Behind them, one of the women spoke loud enough to carry. "She's one of the rejects. You can always tell." Another voice answered, sharper this time. Came all this way just to get passed around. Annabbeth flinched. It was small, but Elias saw it. She turned toward the door, her face drained of color. There are wounds deeper than hunger, colder than frost, like the moment the world looks at you and sees nothing but what you've been worth. Elias stood still, his jaw clenched. His fists didn't rise, but something inside him did. He followed her out the door. The sky had dulled again. Snow began to fall slow and hushed, as if even the wind had heard what was said inside. She stood under the church awning, arms crossed tight over her chest, not speaking. "I'm not who you think I am," she said, at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias stepped beside her, eyes on the horizon. "I know exactly who you are," he replied. "You came out of the storm and into my kitchen. You sewed my sleeve, boiled my tea, cleaned the ash from my stove, and you never asked for anything but space to breathe." She blinked. The snow caught in her lashes. "I brought you here," Elias said, voice low and sure, "to be claimed. I didn't know it'd be by me." Her eyes lifted to meet his, searching. "I'm not clean," she whispered. "Not untouched." "I'm not whole," he answered. "Not unchanged." She started to speak, but Elias stepped forward slowly, gently. He removed one glove and laid his hand on her shoulder, not to possess, not to demand, only to let her feel the truth in it. "Do you want to come back with me?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "I don't have anywhere else to go. You do now," Elias said. They turned together, walked down the steps, past the whispers and the frost-bitten fence rails. Behind them the church bell rang, not for a wedding, not for a funeral, but perhaps, just perhaps, for the start of something not yet named. That night, the fire burned low, but neither of them stirred to add more wood. They sat in quiet side by side, watching embers settle into ash like snowflakes falling backward. Elias hadn't let go of her hand since the crowd dispersed. Not out of claim or habit, just steady presence. As if by holding it he could convince her that she wasn't alone. Not anymore. Annabeth's shoulders had softened, but her eyes still flicked now and then toward the door, like a woman who had lived too long expecting things to be taken away. "I thought I was done with being traded," she said softly. "Letters. Then silence. Then papers." She looked down at her lap. "Even the people in church, they didn't see me. Just my circumstance." Elias didn't answer right away. He reached for a log, fed it gently into the hearth. "They don't know you," he said. "They only saw what the world told them to see." He turned to her, voice low but firm. "That ends here. Sometimes a man doesn't just choose who to love. He chooses the kind of man he'll be in the face of everything trying to pull her away." By morning, Elias had moved the bench closer to the stove and laid out a second pair of mittens he'd once worn during blizzards. Annabeth stirred a small pot of cornmeal, her motions slow but steady. The silence between them now was no longer guarded. It was gentle. As the scent of warm porridge filled the cabin, a knock echoed from the front door. Not urgent, just quiet, hesitant. When Elias opened it, he found Clara, the orphan girl from town, standing with a tin bucket in her hand and snow tangled in her lashes. "Mr. Granger," she sniffled. "I have nowhere to go. Might I have some wood, please?" Before Elias could reply, Annabbeth stepped forward. She knelt, broke a corner of warm cornbread from the skillet, and pressed it into Clara's palm. The child's eyes widened. Her lip trembled. Elias fetched kindling and split logs, wrapping them in a cloth, and tucking them into the girl's bucket. "Come again tomorrow," he said gently. "There'll be more ready." When Clara left, Annabbeth lingered at the door, one hand still clutching her apron. "I should have told you not to open it," she said, voice barely above the wind. Elias turned, stepped behind her. He brushed a crumb from her sleeve and said quietly, "I don't want you to handle hunger alone anymore." In the days that followed, the cabin changed. Elias hung a new shelf near the stove, carved a wooden trunk for her thread and cloth. Her voice began to return in small hums, while sweeping a soft song from Virginia he hadn't heard before. And one evening, after placing 2 bowls of stew on the table, he returned to the hearth and lifted a small wooden board he had been working on since before the storm. The letters burned in by hand. This cabin is no longer a place of silence. He placed it gently on the mantel beneath it, a sprig of lavender tied with string. Annabbeth didn't say a word, but she reached out, took his hand in both of hers, and held it like something precious. If you believe protection goes beyond laws, if you believe that real promises are made with hands and hearts, not just signatures, comment 1. And if you're not sure yet, comment 0. I'd still love to know what you feel. The next morning broke clean and cold. Sky pale as bleached linen snow, crusted hard under a sun that offered no warmth. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled with quiet purpose, its glow casting soft orange light across pine floorboards worn smooth by time. Elias sat at the table, sanding a piece of cedar for a new cupboard latch. Annabbeth was near the stove, humming softly, while sweeping around the hearth. Her hair tied back, sleeves rolled to the elbow, cheeks pink from the heat. It was a peaceful moment. The kind you don't notice until it's gone. Then came the knock. 3 light taps. Hesitant like the hand behind them wasn't sure it was welcome. Elias rose, opened the door. Clara. Same shawl. Same tin bucket. Same wide eyes, this time rimmed with red from cold and something quieter, like hope. "Mr. Granger," she said, barely above a whisper, I came back." Annabbeth moved without thinking. She knelt just as before and offered the child another piece of cornbread, warm, golden torn, fresh from the skillet. Clara took it with 2 hands, holding it like it might vanish. Her lips trembled, but she smiled. "Thank you, ma'am." Elias fetched more wood and tucked it carefully into the bucket, not because she asked, but because he saw the way her fingers curled tighter every time the wind gusted. "This'll last you tonight," he said gently. "If you're cold again tomorrow, the door'll still be here soon." Clara nodded, eyes glistening. Then with a bow too polite for her age, she turned and disappeared down the snowy path, boots crunching like brittle leaves. When the door closed behind her, the silence inside the cabin felt different. Not empty, full. Annabbeth stood still for a moment, then turned to Elias. She didn't just need the wood. "No," he said. She needed to know someone would open the door again. Sometimes it's not the giving that matters most. It's the quiet promise that you'll still be here the next time someone knocks. That afternoon, Elias carved another small bench for near the fire, just the right size for small legs. He didn't say who it was for. He didn't have to. Annabbeth found an old quilt from the storage trunk and laid it over the seat. Then she began mending a pair of tiny mittens from scraps of wool and twine. No one asked. But both of them knew some hearts come back not because they're told to, but because something soft is waiting. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, she lit a second lantern. Its glow made the walls feel closer, warmer. Elias added extra wood to the fire. Not because the room was cold, but because the hush between them now felt like something worth protecting. Later that night, Annabbeth stood by the window, watching flurries dance under the moonlight. Elias came beside her, not speaking. Did you ever think, she said after a while, that maybe we weren't just meant to survive each other's pasts, but to help carry them? He looked at her eyes steady. Maybe that's what families are, he said. People who stay when it would have been easier to leave. She nodded, then leaned her head gently against his shoulder. Sometimes giving isn't charity. It's healing, and the act of offering bread to a child or shelter to a stranger becomes the thing that stitches a life back together. The next days unfolded not like events, but like pages turned gently one at a time. There were no big changes, no loud declarations, only the slow rhythm of a life beginning to take root in the soil of shared routine. Annabbeth folded laundry in the morning light, pinning it along a line stretched between two cedar posts out back. Her sleeves rolled high, fingers red from scrubbing. She moved with a kind of quiet diligence, the sort born not of duty, but of choice. Inside, Elias sanded pine near the fire. A new shelf, a sturdier stool. His movements were calm, deliberate. He whistled as he worked. Not loud, just under his breath. A tune half-remembered, long forgotten until now. You don't always notice when a place becomes home, but it's there in the way the floor stops echoing and starts remembering. The cabin, once a space built only to keep out the cold, began to carry warmth that lingered in more than just the walls. A second coat now hung by the door. 2 mugs stayed clean on the shelf, ready for morning tea. A basket of mended clothes sat neatly under the table, patched with careful hands and different colored thread. Elias showed her how to split a dry log with one clean cleave. She showed him how to wet a cloth before sweeping to catch the dust. Neither spoke much while teaching, but each listened closely, as if the lessons were more than just chores. They were. They were quiet offerings. Little ways of saying, "I trust you," without having to explain why. At supper, they shared one plate between them, more often than 2. Annabbeth began baking more often cornbread biscuits, even a dried apple tart she made with leftover flour, and a tin of fruit Elias had forgotten in the pantry. He took a bite and went still. Haven't tasted pie like that since. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. She looked at him across the table and said softly, "It's simple, but it's something." He smiled. A real one this time. It stayed. That night he added another log to the fire long after she'd fallen asleep on the bench. Then he went to the mantel, picked up the small wooden sign he had burned with careful letters days before. This cabin is no longer a place of silence. He turned it gently in his hands. Then with a nod, set it back where it belonged. They never said when it happened. No line marked it. No date circled. But sometime between the sound of laundry snapping in the wind, the hush of a needle moving through cloth, and the shared sip of warm tea at dawn, the cabin stopped being a shelter and became a home. Spring didn't arrive with a fanfare that year. No trumpets in the wind, no sudden thaw. Just a slow softening, the kind you only notice when your boots sink a little deeper in the earth, and the snow on the ridge melts into song. On a morning brushed with mist and wild clover, Elias hitched the mule and loaded a single wooden bench onto the cart. No ribbons, no preacher's bell. Only a piece of folded cloth in Annabbeth's hands, a white dress sewn from the curtains that once hung forgotten in a storage trunk. The sleeves were uneven, the hem stitched in mismatched thread. But when she walked, it moved like something long held back, finally stepping into the light. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders in soft waves. In her hand, she held a sprig of clover, picked just minutes before damp with dew. Elias stood barefoot in the grass. He wore his cleanest shirt, faded at the seams, patched once by her own needle. A dried sprig of lavender peeked from the breast pocket, his mother's favorite flower. Not all weddings are dressed in gold. Some are clothed in courage, stitched in memory, and held together by nothing but the will to stay. There was no altar, no organ, no pews, just a hilltop overlooking the wide Montana Valley, the hush of a few townsfolk who came not out of duty but out of witness. Clara stood near the old widow, clutching a straw doll. The pastor from town who had once turned Annabbeth away stood quietly, Bible in hand, but said nothing unless asked. Elias turned to Annabbeth. "I don't have rings," he said. "Only this." From his pocket he pulled a long braid of dried meadow grass. Rough, uneven, but strong. "Not a vow for show," he said. "A promise. In dust and years in the storm that brought you here. I'm yours, Annabbeth, in full." Her eyes welled with tears, but her voice was steady. "And I've always been mine," she whispered. "Until now. Because now I'm yours too." He tied the grass cord gently around both their wrists. The knot held. Wind moved softly through the clover. Somewhere nearby, a sparrow landed on a fence post and chirped. Clara clapped once, bright and sudden. "They got wings now," she shouted. Laughter rippled across the hill, not loud but deep, the kind that rises when something broken quietly mends. Afterwards, there was no feast, no music. But someone left a jar of honey near the bench. A woman placed a cloth doll on the windowsill of the cabin, and a man with no teeth left a note that simply read, "Stay warm. You deserve to." Elias took Annabeth's hand and led her back to the wagon. They didn't rush. There was no hurry. Because what had begun in silence, what had survived storm and shame, had now been chosen freely, not by law, not by contract, but by love that asked for nothing but to stay. That evening, the light in the cabin felt different. Not brighter, just fuller, like the walls themselves had softened. There were no garlands, no candles, just the steady scent of wood smoke and warm bread, and the quiet sound of Clara humming as she played with her straw doll near the hearth. Annabbeth stood by the stove, hands deep in dough, the skirt of her wedding dress now covered by a worn apron. Her cheeks were dusted with flour, and a smudge had found its way across her chin. Elias watched her from his chair and smiled, not because of the moment, but because he knew it wasn't a moment at all. It was a life beginning. But even as the house breathed new warmth, something tugged gently at the edge of Elias's thoughts. A weight not heavy but present. A chapter not yet closed but ready to be turned. After supper, he stepped into the back room, opened the drawer beneath the old mantel, and pulled out a small pine box. The hinges creaked as he opened it. Inside, wrapped in linen, lay a photograph. Some memories aren't meant to be buried. They're meant to sit quietly beside the new ones and bless the hands that still carry them. The picture was faded now. The edges curled, the glass cracked in the corner, but the face within it was still clear. A woman with auburn hair and a lopsided smile. Elias's first wife. He carried it back into the main room where the fire still glowed low and steady. He placed it gently on the mantel beside the wooden sign he'd carved weeks ago. This cabin is no longer a place of silence. Annabbeth paused when she saw it. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached into her satchel and pulled something folded and yellowed, a delicate paper snowflake. The last letter from the fiancé she lost to Gettysburg. She unfolded it carefully, placed it beside the photo. Not over it. Not instead of it. Just beside. 2 lives. 2 losses, 2 beginnings. Elias looked at her eyes soft. They should both be here, he said. Annabbeth reached out gently, adjusted the photo so it didn't touch the snowflake, but stood close enough that it felt right. Then she turned to him. We don't have to forget who we were to love who we've become. He stepped forward and kissed her brow. Outside, the wind rustled lightly through the trees. Not cold now, not fierce, just familiar. Clara, half asleep by the hearth, whispered something in her dreams. Annabbeth tucked a blanket around her. Elias returned the pine box to its place, but this time it wasn't hidden. It stood open. Welcome. Some people say the past should be left behind, but sometimes the past just wants a seat at the table, to be remembered, to be honored. Not to stay, but to bless what comes next. She had nowhere else to go. That's how it began. A knock in a snowstorm, a trembling voice in a stranger's kitchen. But now the snow had melted, and Clara was chasing chickens across the yard, her laughter echoing through the pines. Elias stood by the fence he'd rebuilt with his own hands, watching Annabbeth hang fresh linens on the line her wedding dress, now just another cloth kissed by wind. Inside the cabin, cornbread cooled on the sill, and a wooden board on the wall reminded them both. This is no longer a place of silence. The past hadn't vanished, but it no longer haunted. It held its place, respected, remembered, while love did what it always does when given space. It stayed. So tell me this, have you ever opened a door that changed everything? Would you have let her in or walked away? Comment your answer below, because the frontier isn't just out there, it's in the choices we make. And maybe your next story is waiting just beyond the snow.